Okay, so we have a lot to cover today. I am going to, while I'm standing here, I am going to pull up a sample essay that I will read to you, and then we're going to talk about how the exam will be administered. So we've got to finish covering ethics today, and then I will talk about the exam, the mechanics of the exam, a sample essay, and what you need to do in order to be successful in the essay, which will require that you cite sources. So I'm going to talk about what would constitute sort of an A, B, and C level response to an ethics essay. The exam will be on Thursday. I have reserved class time for you to work on the exam, so you do not have to come to class, and I sent out an email about this on Thursday, and you do not have to log in to the WebEx or to YouTube on Thursday, because it will be reserved for you to do the exam. The exam will be posted on D2L. There will be instructions on D2L, and you do not have to come to class, and you will have 1 week to complete the exam, because the essay will require that you do cite sources. You can use any form that you want in terms of citation, either APA, MLA, or the Blue Book, or whatever suits you for citation. So we'll talk about that at the end. Before I forget, let me pull up an exam that I can read to you and give you sort of an example, a walkthrough of what the exam will look like in terms of the essay portion of the exam. The exam will be up by Thursday. And then you have a week to complete it. Again, you do not have to come to class on Thursday, because that time is reserved for you to work on the exam. That's the one I want. That one is pretty short. Okay. So we were talking about challenges to philosophical ethics. And these bring up issues of what I've talked about, questions of knowledge, questions of conduct, and questions of governance, which are the 3 questions philosophy attempts to answer. They're applicable to marketing, because we have to think about what it is we can know. If we're going to say that we're selling tables, how do we know that we're selling this table? That's not as clear to me as it might be. What is good advertising? What is ethical advertising? That's a question of knowledge. The question of conduct, what should we be able to market? And the question of governance. What can we legally, in the regulatory environment, for example, govern? Now, you don't have to answer these 3 questions using philosophy. There are other ways that you can answer these questions. Both of those ways are problematic. You can answer these questions, and one of the things that you see with regard to psychological egoism, subjectivism, and cultural relativism is these are usually predicated on sort of a mythology. That's one way to answer these questions, mythology, right? And we have lots of mythologies. Generally, we think of mythologies as being dead religions, right? Like the Greeks had all of these gods and a pantheon, and we think of that as a dead religion and a mythology. But we also have civic or civil mythologies. For example, one of the mythologies in the United States is that the Pilgrims came here to escape religious persecution. That's not exactly true, right? That's part of the mythology, that they wanted religious freedom. No, they wanted to impose their religious views on everybody else, and the Church of England said, no, we're not going to do that, right? We're going to, stick to pretty much church doctrine. We're not going to let you, impose your radical views on everybody else. So that's kind of a mythology, but it explains how, for example, how we originated as a nation, right? It's an explanation story. You can expand using religion. If you use religion, the problem is going to be whose book are we going to use, right? In this nation, we consider ourselves a Judeo-Christian nation primarily, although we don't have an official state religion. You can see how this would be problematic, particularly for business. So the best way to answer these questions is philosophy. And as an activity, it allows us to sharpen our minds and think more critically. Think about the dialectic and how it can be used, for example, in sales, when we talk about Socrates and Plato. So we talked about subjectivism, the belief that the self is all one can know, solipsism, therefore ethics is all based in the individual. Well, that's not going to be terribly useful, because if we said that, we couldn't hold anybody accountable for anything. And we can't offer proofs in ethics. I gave you a pretty good argument how we can argue proofs. We can present evidence, and based on evidence, we can apply rules, and based on those rules, we can achieve outcomes, and those are proofs in ethics, right? Cultural relativism, used by businesses to justify actions, specifically, especially in international trade. These are problematic. They allow, again, for exceptionalism. And for us to say, our society is better, and maybe we should think about that. If we took it to its extremes, you couldn't say that, ethnic genocide is wrong under Nazi Germany. And so I think we can dispense with that argument pretty quickly. The more difficult one is psychological egoism, which really deals with not only what can we know, but how can we learn, or can we actually learn? Now, this one doesn't sound right. This one says that either as a product of nature or nurture or a combination of the two, free will is illusory. We don't really have it. You think you have it, but you don't. You behave in very predictable ways. And for those of you in the online class, I'm going to erase this for 1 minute, turn the screen off. And an example of this in marketing is an argument made by a guy named, so that you can get the site, I'll raise this up, Martin Lindstrom, in a book called Biology. He argues that people respond to marketing pitches in very predictable ways. And one of the ways that he shows that we do this is they use an fMRI machine to monitor people's responses to ads. And it turns out that on survey research, people say when they see these anti-smoking ads, you all have probably seen them. So for example, there's one that was very famous that came out several years ago that you've probably seen, where it says, smoking companies tell you that it's cool, that the beautiful people smoke, and that it'll make you popular, and all of these other things. And they show all of these like movie stars, and and the Marlboro Man out riding the range. And then it says, would you still smoke if you knew you'd end up like this? And it shows this guy who's lost all of his hair. He's kind of gray, and he's got part of his limbs are cut off, and he's on an oxygen mask, and probably needs to be on a ventilator. And what Lindstrom argues is that when we put people in fMRI machines that are smokers, they watch those ads, and the part of the brain that's triggering is not the part that shows fear. It's the pleasure part of the brain. And so people are watching these ads, and they're responding to them in a predictable way. On surveys, they say, oh, I want to quit smoking right away. Sign me up. And they're jonesing for a cigarette, and the minute they get out to the parking lot, they're lighting up, right? Well, the problem with this is that although we can tell what part of the brain is active, it doesn't tell us what people are actually thinking, or how they're actually going to respond to those feelings once they've thought about them and once they've internalized them. And those ads are really not designed, if you think about it, for smokers. They're really designed to keep people from smoking, and he doesn't test that. So there's problems with it. Another problem with psychological egoism is that it says we will always behave in our own self-interest. We always behave selfishly. Now, this doesn't seem intuitively appealing because we see people engaging in altruism all the time. The late, great Mother Teresa, who's been beatified by the faith of the Holy See, spent all of her life caring for the poorest and sickest and most rejected among us. Surely that's an example of altruism. People who believe in this philosophy would say, no, it's not. She's just doing what she wanted because she had good feelings that flowed from it. Or maybe because God told her to and she was divinely inspired. You wouldn't want to disobey God. The problem with that argument is it relies on a fallacy of equivocation. It conflates the feelings that follow from doing something with the motivation for doing it. And while we may get good feelings from helping our neighbor, that doesn't mean that that's the motivation. And it doesn't tell us what people do when they're enormously conflicted, and they are all the time. People are oftentimes very conflicted in their choices that they have to make. And so it doesn't seem intuitively appealing, but if you think about it at a deeper level, it is hard to dispense with. Again, for a determinist, which psychological egoism is what we call a deterministic philosophy, they would say we can't help but want things. So for example, can you will yourself to not want something? Well, when I ask this question and I have more time in class when I teach marketing ethics, students always say, yes, I can will myself to not want something. I'm not sure that's clear that you can. Because what a determinist would say is, no, you just want something else more. You're not buying the shoes that you want because you want the money in your bank account more than you want the shoes. But you didn't will yourself to want that either. Well, the problem with that kind of argument is that when we look at the range of human experience and human emotions and human motivations, when we start saying people always do this, it becomes very suspect. It's very difficult. There's a lot of variance in there, right? And so if you can find one example where it doesn't hold true, you've disproven it. So what are the valid ethical theories then? What makes these not valid? That one's a duplicate slide. So what are the problems with these challenges? And I forgot to go through those slides on the last one. I was talking about these earlier. They are up on D2L, so you can look at those to remind you of what I said. I talked about each of those in turn, and that's what the slides show. And I just forgot to click through them. I apologize for that on Tuesday and today. What are the problems with the challenges? Well, they're emotive. They're based on emotion. I feel. Well, I feel this way, and you feel that way. Well, that's a problem. By the way, I appreciate, it says people with mental handicaps don't always follow that rule. I'm not doing bonus points today because I got to get through a voluminous amount. I forgot to mention that at the beginning. I get it through so much material so that we can get to the test that I'm not doing bonus points today. And I intended to send an email out to that, but I forgot, and I apologize for that. That's not gonna work. Emotions are not gonna work. We're gonna have to be based on reason. It's not rational because it's emotive. These challenges to ethics are not based on reason. They're not rational, and therefore we can't come up with universal rules because they allow for exceptionalism. They allow me to say, well, I feel this way and I'm special. That's the narcissistic view. I'm special. I'm unique. I'm above the rules. Well, no, you're not. Or my country is unique. We're special. We're the chosen ones. Well, no, you're not, right? And so we have to come up with something that meets those three criteria that deals with that. So what are the valid theories? They are based on reason. They are not emotive, and they don't allow for exceptionalism. Now, that is not to say that all of these theories that we'll talk about don't have problems. They do, and I will talk about the problems associated with them. But they are at least minimally valid because they meet these three criteria. They are based on a rational analysis. We can develop rules and principles from them, and as a result of those rules and principles, we can universalize those theories to all people at all places at all times. There aren't problems, but we can universalize them, and they don't allow, therefore, for exceptions. They don't allow me to claim I'm special, I'm unique, my group is special, my group is unique. I'm the one that matters, right? So what are the valid ethical theories? Well, the oldest one that we can find out, this fully worked out system of philosophy, goes back to Socrates and Plato. We don't know anything about Socrates except from two sources. One, his most famous student, Plato, who wrote down what Socrates says, or at least that's what he says. I don't think we should take Plato at his word. He basically says, all I am is a scribe for Socrates. And in one of his epistles, he says this. I just wrote down what Socrates said. I don't think we should take him at his word. There's a lot of Plato in Socrates, and there's maybe a lot of Socrates in Plato. He didn't write anything down. He would not get tenure, one of the greatest minds of the Western tradition. He did not get tenure, or would not get tenure at a modern university today, because he didn't write any of this stuff down. He just sort of walked around Athens asking hard questions, and that's what he does in Republic. This is the first fully worked out system of philosophy that we know. So one of the questions becomes, is philosophy, what is philosophy? I've sort of told you what it is. It's this reasoned approach, critical approach to these three questions of life and academic disciplines. Did the Greeks invent it? There's all kinds of theories about whether or not the Greeks invented it. Most scholars do think that the Greeks actually did invent philosophy. There are echoes of pre-philosophic thought, but the Greeks, for some reason, and why did it happen? In about 500 years, 2,500 years ago, and 500 years before the Common Era, BCE. So when we talk about dating now, we usually use the terms. In the past, we used to be BC, which stood for before Christ, and Anno Domini, which stands for in the year of our Lord. Modern scholars now prefer the terms BCE, before the Common Era, and CE, the Common Era, to denote these areas. So why did it happen in Athens at this time, about 500 years before the Common Era? Well, the Greeks didn't have a really good system of religion. That may be one reason. The gods in Greek mythology were not the people who you were turning to for these ultimate questions of life. They're messy characters. They're coming down to earth and they're mating with people, and they produce demigods as a result of this. And they're capable of being killed. How did Zeus become the king of the gods? Well, he killed the older gods. He killed his father and disgorged his brothers from his father who had eaten them. These are not folks that you turn to for the ultimate questions of life, you see. So the Greeks had to come up with something else. They turned to philosophy. And the oldest, most fully worked out, now there may have been fully worked out systems of philosophy before Plato, and we see this in some of the pre-Socratic philosophers, but a lot of their writings are lost maybe to us. So this is the first fully worked out. You see in Republic a system of epistemology, a system that deals with conduct, and a system that is fundamentally political science. It also, Professor Daniel Robinson argues, is a work of psychology in Republic. Well, what are the more modern theories? And you can find echoes of both utilitarian and deontological in Republic. You can find echoes of that in Aristotle, and we'll talk about Aristotle's virtue. I do dote on Aristotle. He is my favorite. What are these theories? The duty ethics may be actually older. Teleological ethics, usually we date that to the modern version of utilitarianism, to John Stuart Mill, Jeremy Bentham. If we think about this as in terms of a Hegelian dialectic, you have duty ethics, which is a little bit older, and in response to duty ethics, you get an antithesis. The antithesis is utilitarianism, and from that you get a synthesis, if you think of it in Hegelian terms. So what is the teleological, which means ends, perspective? This is often the one that business students like the most because it is used to justify capitalism. So economic theory, capitalistic economic theory is predicated on teleological principles. In other words, it's predicated on what are the results of something. In capitalistic terms, we talk about the maximization of utility. So business students like this version the best of ethics. What is the maximization of utility? Well, economists are infamous for coming up with fancy terms that describe what we all know intuitively. The maximization of utility is just a fancy way of saying you should get the most bang for your buck as an individual. In the aggregate, what we think of is that the free hand of the market will determine how we should allocate resources in the most efficient manner. Now, what's maybe wrong with this theory? And we've never, by the way, had a purely capitalistic theory. And if we can see what's the problem maybe with pure capitalism, we can see maybe what's sort of going to be the problem with the maximization of happiness, which is what we think about in terms of utilitarian ethics. Not the maximization of our economic utility, but the maximization of happiness. Well, what's wrong with this? Well, first of all, let's start out with what is the maximization of utility? Well, it's the maximization of property. What is the maximization of property? Well, property is defined by the sovereign. And so some of the things that you might think of as being property are not property, and some things that you might not think of as being property are property. Well, what's this got to do with anything? Well, what's not property? People are not property. Yeah, you can't, it's creepy. You can't sell your body. You can't will yourself. Property has three characteristics. It's alienable. It's AD&D, so it spells add. It's alienable, which means that during your lifetime, you can give it away, you can abandon it, or you can sell it. So is the cocaina your property? Is cocaine your property? No, it's not alienable. You can't sell it. If you do, you're going to go to jail. It's not property, right? So there are lots of limitations to property. So we already start with nothing is purely capitalistic because the sovereign says that's not property. Now you can touch it, you can taste it, you can experience it, but it's illegal, not property. It's not divisible. You can't leave it to somebody in your will, and it's not descendable. Now it's interesting, in this debate, the state of Oklahoma now seems to say that marijuana is property because you can buy it and sell it, and within restrictions, right? You have to have a card. The state of Colorado, the federal government still says it's not property, technically. There are some things that we just think that maybe you shouldn't, because of the externalities involved, you shouldn't do that. What's that? Well, let's take the Grand Canyon, for example. This is real property. It is real property. But should we sell it to Disney? I bet Disney could put in one heck of a ride down the Grand Canyon. You go to the Grand Canyon today, and really, you know, it's a little bit like stepping back in time. I mean, you know, they've got these little mules that will take you to the bottom of the Grand Canyon. At least the last time I was there, they still had the mule thing that would take you to the bottom or back up the mule train to the top of the Grand Canyon. I bet Disney could really do a heck of a job on that. My best friend's mother, her husband took them on a family vacation, and I remember my friend coming back and telling me the story, to the Grand Canyon. His mother got out. She was a wheat farmer. She grew up on a wheat farm here in Oklahoma. And she said, Frank, this is the worst case of soil management in the history of the United States. Why you couldn't raise a ruckus out here? It's ugly. Why'd you bring me here? And if I were younger, I'd divorce you. That was a common refrain from her. I recall being at their house multiple times and her saying, Frank, if I were younger, I'd divorce you. Charming woman. Just the kind of person we all want to marry. Well, you know, maybe we got to dump nuclear waste out there. It's not good. You can't raise a ruckus on it. No, maybe we shouldn't do that. Maybe we shouldn't sell it to Disney. There are things that we value more highly than just property. Well, you can start to see with this idea of the greatest happiness, maybe there are some things that we shouldn't do. Now, in order to correct for this problem, Utilitarianism takes two forms. The older form is called act utilitarianism, which says that in every situation, we need to analyze the consequences of the act that we're about to undertake and promote the greatest happiness. No two interactions are ever exactly the same. I oftentimes have people say to me, don't you get tired of teaching the same classes over and over again? And I say, no, I don't, because it's never the same. I never quite give the lecture the same. Students never quite respond exactly the same way. I have different students with different interests. Sometimes I have students that are in here from fashion marketing that have a different perspective than maybe my purely business students, or I have more accounting students that have a different perspective from those that are mostly marketing students or whatever. And so I never really teach the same. A man never steps into the same river twice. That's from the ancient Greek, right? And that's true. If you put your foot in the river and then you take it out, technically, and you put it back in, you've not stepped into the same river because the river's changed. If for no other reason than the particulate matter of the water is different. And rivers do change. Depending on the riverbed, they move, they meander. The Grand Canyon is water erosion. But through the course of human experience, there are enough similarities that we can come up with rules, right, that might deal with this, that make it less complex than having to, in every situation, think about whether or not we should engage in Act A or Act B. And in the aggregate, maybe these rules will produce the greatest happiness. So act utilitarianism, we have to analyze all of the facts, take into account all the stakeholders. So this is an important term that you should know for the test. Stakeholders as opposed to shareholders. That's everybody who's impacted by a business decision. So when a business makes a decision, they're not only impacting the owners or the shareholders, they're impacting the employees, the suppliers of that business, which rely on that business for business. They're impacting the customers of that business, society as a whole, and oftentimes the planet and other beings. So we have this idea in stakeholder theory that businesses which have usually focused on what's been called the bottom line or profits should maybe focus on what we now consider the triple bottom line: people, planet, and profits. Well, that becomes a daunting task, doesn't it? So maybe we can devise some rules which help simplify that task, which make it easier to come up with, that maybe in the aggregate don't apply the best. So I'll give you an example of this in business. There is something called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the United States, which prohibits American businessmen from bribing officials in other nations. Now, American businesses often argue that this hampers them from engaging in the most utility for their customers, their employees, and their shareholders. Because I can't engage in bribery, it's illegal, I am put at a disadvantage against businessmen from other countries who don't have something called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Well, in that instance, it would seem that we are imposing a rule which is not utilitarian, but in the aggregate, it actually is. What that rule recognizes is that if we encourage other nations, because we are the largest economy, and if we say American businesses can't do business with you, it encourages them to stop these practices which are inherently unfair to their own people. Right? And if you think about it more broadly, it would be justifiable even under act utilitarianism, because when you engage in this kind of bribery, you are in effect impacting not just your shareholders, not just your suppliers, and not just your employees and customers. You're impacting the people in that nation that have to deal with this. And it perpetuates that system of governance. So we'll come up with a rule that attempts to address this. What is the problem with utilitarianism? Well, the means justify the end, and there are some things that this video is no longer working, the link is broken, CNN took it down. They had a special on several years ago that I used to show called The Bitter Truth, and it was in their Edocracy section. And most people don't know this, but a large percentage of our chocolate is produced using slave labor to this day. Now, a very small number of people are enslaved so that all of us can enjoy chocolate. From a strictly utilitarian perspective, either both rule and act, you can justify that. But some of us just say, that's really creepy. And maybe it is, these are two words that I'll use that you should know for the exam. It is a priori wrong. A priori is knowledge that you don't have to experience to gain. You don't have to be enslaved to know a priori this is wrong. You don't have to experience it, as opposed to a posteriori. This is knowledge that you do have to experience to gain. You can see this with the mind's eye. I have concealed carry permit. You don't have to experience death to know you don't want it. Right? I can't come into this classroom and shoot you because it's a priori wrong. Right? You don't have to experience that. Voltaire in Candide talks about this. There's an old woman in Candide. It's one of the books that is on my list. By the way, from time to time, students do ask me, not so much since I've become a business professor, but when I was a liberal arts professor, students would ask me, what should I have read to become truly educated? And I have a list of books that you should read. If you don't agree with my list, you're welcome to come up with your own list. One of the books on there is Candide by Voltaire. There's an old woman, and she says, you know, she's been enslaved. She's gone through a hard life. She started out as the daughter of a pope. Needless to say, popes aren't supposed to have daughters. She gets captured by some pirates and enslaved, and at one point in time, they cut off half of her buttocks and eat it to avoid starvation. And at the end of this, she says, and through all of this, I went on loving life. I've known very few people have actually taken their own lives. That's true. Very few people do. Most of us cling to life, even in the most horrific of circumstances. You can know that a priori. And even rule utilitarianism would allow for this. And so there's a problem, but it is rational. It is not emotive. We can come up with rules. We can come up with solutions when we do the calculus. Maybe we don't want to do the calculus, but we can come up with rules that apply in all places at all times. And so it is a valid ethical theory. Duty ethics or deontological ethics, again, has two types. The older type, the pre-Greek type, is religious absolutism. Well, how do we know what the duties are? How do we ascertain them? Well, they're in the book. So we're going to turn to the book. Well, you can see what's going to be problematic with that. This is not philosophical reasoning. And we're going to have a problem with whose book are we going to use, right? In a previous lecture, I said something like, when you read the Bible, you need to think. Right? You have to think. So there's lots of rules in the Bible. Leviticus 18:20, if a man lies with another man as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. Their blood shall surely be upon them. Right? Well, in the words of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the Bible is the word of God through the words of man speaking in the idiom of his time. And the richness of the Bible comes from the fact that we don't take it as literally so, that it was dictated by God. And it is the struggle, according to the Archbishop, to understand culture and context that provide the richness of the Bible. Now, why am I talking about this in a marketing class in a secular institution? Well, because we do see businesses relying upon this, right? They use the Bible. There are many businesses in the United States. Hobby Lobby, for example, fought an entire lawsuit over their desire to impose their or avoid a rule of law, and it was based on biblical principles. The point here is that it's not going to work from a philosophical standpoint. We're going to have to come up with something else. So Immanuel Kant comes up with rational absolutism as opposed to religious absolutism. Rational absolutism is based not on the book, but on the mind's eye. What we can discern a priori. What we can discern a priori. Now, in Kant's three critiques, there's a critique of practical reason, a critique of pure reason, and the metaphysics of morals. Kant talks about two kinds of imperatives. There are hypothetical imperatives. Hypothetical imperatives may have moral import, although they may not. Hypothetical imperatives exist because we want something, and some things are amoral. Not immoral, they are amoral. Very little is amoral, but there are things that are beyond the realm of morality. So, for example, one of the things that students oftentimes say, and I don't have children myself, but I have lots of nieces and nephews, and they question whether or not college is a good investment. Historically speaking, college was almost a golden ticket to the middle class. If you wanted to become middle class or better, you went to college and you got a profession. That's no longer true. There are lots and lots of people who graduate from college and they have nothing to do with their degree. I hate to disparage one of the academic pursuits that we teach here, but musical theater. If you get a degree in musical theater, the chances of you using that and becoming a big Broadway star or a Hollywood actor are very, very slim. I would suggest you get a sales degree. I'm being shameless in my self-promotion of the sales program, right? I have lots of students that have graduated with musical theater degrees, and they're still working at Starbucks. I'm sorry. And they're talented. They're extremely talented. There's a lot of talent out there. You can watch my karaoke videos on YouTube, and you can quickly discern that I don't have any of that talent. Oh, have you watched my karaoke?
No, I said I'm going to find them.
Oh, well, they're there. You can watch them. I love karaoke. I'm not very good. But there are lots of people. Go to karaoke on any night that they have karaoke. There's a club here, I think it's still open, called Don Quixote's, which does karaoke every night. And a lot of the kids from Oklahoma City University go there and sing. And put me to shame. There's a lot of talent out there. But historically speaking, if you wanted to achieve middle class or greater, you went to college. You got a degree. That's no longer the case. What I do tell my nieces and nephews when they ask me these questions, when they regale me with these questions, is that I can guarantee that if you don't go to college and you don't get a degree, you're probably not going to have a chance of achieving better than middle class lifestyle. Unless you have a skill. That's my caveat. If you want to go, welders make a lot of money. Electricians make a lot of money. Plumbers make a lot of money. There's an old joke that says the neurosurgeon has a broken toilet. He calls the plumber. The plumber comes in, hammers around on the toilet for 15 minutes and gives the guy a bill for $350. And the neurosurgeon looks at him and says, I operate on brains and I didn't make $350 in 15 minutes. And the plumber looks at him and says, well, neither did I when I was a neurosurgeon. So there are exceptions, but generally speaking, if you want to have a good job, then the problem with being a plumber is that it's also you make a lot of money, but I don't want to do it. I have these 4 old homes in Guthrie, and I do a lot of the stuff myself. I've set toilets and things like that and fixed leaks. It's not fun crawling around under a house with the spiders and things like that, and doing that. I can do it, don't want to. Would rather do this. So hypothetical imperatives exist because we want something, and that may be beyond morality, right? There's very little moral import to me getting a college degree or not, as long as I continue to be a productive citizen. Categorical imperatives, on the other hand, for Kant, exist because there is a moral imperative. Now, what is the categorical imperative? Now, you can't start to recite the categorical imperative after you've had a glass of wine or two and not begin to smile a little bit. What is the categorical imperative? Well, Kant says the categorical imperative is this, basically. It's a formulation, something along these lines. Never treat another rational being as a means to an end, but rather as an end in and of themselves. Now, why is this not attractive to business students? Why is utilitarianism attractive to business students, but not the categorical imperative? Well, what does that mean? What is a rational being? Well, a rational being for Kant, based on his knowledge, was another human being. Now, it turns out maybe there are more rational beings out there than we thought. Animal psychology is uncovering that there are lots of species in the animal world that dolphins, for example, seem to have some sense of morality. Franz de Waal studies this and notices that elephants, for example, rely on an idea of morality and reciprocity. Prairie dogs have a very advanced communication system. They actually have adjectives and adverbs. At least they think that in their communication with each other. But for Kant, a rational being was a human being. So what does that mean? Well, you can't lie. Well, this seems simple enough, but after you've had a lie, really never lie? So there's a movie, Pretty Woman. Many of you have probably seen it. It's a rather old movie now. But in that, Richard Gere engages in a lie. He's trying to take over another company. He's what's called an arbitrageur. He buys companies up and he breaks them up into pieces because they're worth more. The parts are worth more than the whole. And if you can arbitrage, if you can do this, arbitrage is technically where in another temporal frame, the risk of loss is 0 and usually greater than 0. And there's an old saying that says, if you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. If you teach a man to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. If you teach a man to arbitrage, you will feed him and his family for generations to come. Well, he's trying to buy this company. It's a ship company. He's going to break it up. The guy wants to meet with him. He meets with him. And Richard Gere's character says, he says, well, I'll buy your stock back from you. He says, no, you won't. You don't have the money. And he says, yes, we do. We have Navy contracts. And Gere says, no, you don't. I've talked to Senator so-and-so. You don't have those contracts. That says you have dirty politicians in your pocket. The meeting ends. At the end, Richard Gere comes to the epiphany that maybe he's not such a good guy and his company doesn't manufacture anything. They don't produce anything. And maybe he should reform. So he sets about to try and help this guy. And the guy says, well, what about those contracts? And he says, well, I was just bluffing. They weren't really dead. And the old man says, you lied? And Richard Gere's character says, yeah, it's my job. Never lie. How about making it more personal to you than a big business deal? Never lie. How many of you have an insignificant other, a significant other, a boyfriend, a girlfriend, a fiancé, that's Oklahoman for fiance? The whole dictionary, I think I've told you this. I had a judge one time tell me that the epitome of my case seemed to be epitome. That's EPITOME. And I said, I'm sorry, Your Honor. He said, epitome, E-P-I-T-O-M-E. Are you an idiot? No, Your Honor. Put that one down in the dictionary. That word is pronounced epitome. A boyfriend, a girlfriend, a husband, a wife. Nobody's raising their hand. You all are socially awkward and incapable of human relations. Well, okay. Most people have these, right? Never lie. Maybe it's the reason I'm divorced. Brutal honesty. How do I look in this outfit? Well, Robin, you look like hell in pastels. You look like death warmed over. You are not a summer. You're definitely a fall or winter. Go back upstairs and change. Never lie. The hypothetical of the inquiring murderer. You know, there's this murderer named Jones. He's looking for Smith. He comes to your door. Where's Smith? Never lie. Kant would say no. If bad results happen, that's just too bad. You can't lie. Well, most of us say that's just too harsh. And I think if we started pinning Kant down, we can't because he's dead. But I think if we start, why is it that people can't lie? Well, ultimately, because if we all lied, there's a movie with Ricky Gervais called The Invention of Lying. And in it, he creates the first lie, right? And bad things happen. And I think that would be ultimately, if you started arguing with him, if you did the dialectic, I think he would say that ultimately, if you relied on lying, you could never form a society. And ultimately, isn't that a backdoor way of saying that results really do matter? That results really are important? I think it is. Oh, let's see. Wrong way. Which brings me to now I will tell you that I am, generally speaking, I consider myself a neo-Kantian. What does that mean? Well, I generally agree with Kant, although I would recognize I do recognize hold on, I've got a meeting for school, and they just texted me today. I do recognize that there are exceptions to every rule, right? Which leads me to, although I'm a neo-Kantian, I love Aristotle, I dote on Aristotle, and maybe a holistic approach to this problem provides a solution. Virtue ethics. Aristotle really, again, you can trace virtue ethics, you can trace them back to Republic and Socrates and Plato, although it's most fully worked out by Aristotle in his two major treatises on ethics, the Nicomachean Ethics and the Eudemian Ethics. The Eudemian Ethics is named for, I believe, one of Aristotle's students. The Nicomachean Ethics is named for his son, Nicodemus. Most scholars believe that the Eudemian Ethics is a preliminary work, and the more fully worked out ethics is the Nicomachean Ethics. And this becomes important in just a minute. I'll explain. However, Sir Anthony Kenny at Oxford and Professor Daniel and Robinson, who also taught at Oxford, I both believe make arguments that the Eudemian Ethics may be the more complete work. And the reason I point this out is because virtue ethics is founded on basically what we have to do is we have to start out with, in order to determine what is a good system of ethics and virtue, which is a holistic approach. And what do I mean by a holistic approach? Duty ethics and utilitarian ethics tell us what to do in discrete situations. I shouldn't lie to you in this class. I shouldn't say follow the syllabus and then change it, right? That's a discrete situation. Virtue ethics attempts to tell us how to become a better person. It's a holistic approach. It is through virtue. So we have to determine what the end of a human being is. What is the purpose of a human being? What is the terminus ad quem of a human being? Well, I don't know. What is the terminus ad quem of a human being? Aristotle says that the terminus ad quem of a human being is in the ancient Greek the word eudaimonia. How is this word usually translated? The word is usually translated as happiness. The end of a human being is happiness. However, Professor Daniel Robinson argues that that's not a good translation of the Greek word eudaimonic. Because in happiness, Aristotle didn't mean the hedonistic version. Eat, drink, and be merry. Drink up and let's have another round, for tomorrow we may die. That's not it. That's not the eudaimonic life. The eudaimonic life is the flourishing life. How did we achieve the terminus ad quem of what is a human? Well, you achieve it by getting to the point at which it no longer makes sense to ask the question, why? I was a why child. That's one of the reasons I don't have children. I was a why child. This is children philosophize, right? Why can't I have another cookie? Well, shut up, I told you. That's your parent's response. That's not a philosophical answer. Because I said so. Shut up, I say. No. Why can't you? Well, because cookies aren't good for you. Well, why aren't they good for me? Because they're not nutritious. Well, why do I need nutrition? Well, because if you don't have nutrition, you won't flourish and grow, and if you don't flourish and grow, ultimately you will die. That's the terminus ad quem. That's the point at which it no longer makes sense to say why. Of course, you can ask why, and I would have been the child that asked why. And my mother at that point, who was somewhat of a philosopher and a teacher, she taught comparative religion, would have said, well, Grant, you can't beat a dead horse. That's the terminus ad quem. Well, you could sit on it for a while, right? So it's the flourishing life. How do we achieve the flourishing life? Well, for Aristotle, we see it in the politics. We see it in friendship, in his treatise on friendship. It's a balancing act. It's the mean between two extremes. What can we as marketers take away from Aristotle on friendship? Aristotle says there's three types of friendship. There's friendship grounded in utility. That's business relationships. They're useful. There's friendship grounded in pleasure. That's your party buddies. And there's perfected friendship, which is the middle. It's the means between the extremes. Good men are useful to each other. They find pleasure in each other's company. But the purpose of the friendship is not that. A befriends B because he wants what's best for him. These are the friendships of a lifetime. You do this calculus, this balancing act through everything, through politics. There are good governments and bad governments. There are good governments of one, two, and many. And it's the middle ground. It's usually the best. What's an extreme defect of character? Cowardice. The coward always runs away from a battle. What's the opposite of cowardice? It's not courage, it's heedlessness. The heedless person always charges into battle. What's the balance? It's courage. The courageous person knows when to fight the good fight. Now, the criticisms of Aristotle in virtue ethics are, I think, unfair, which is why I like it. How do we determine what the end of a human being is? Well, I think Aristotle gives us a very good definition of the end of it. He does a good analysis, so I think we can dismiss that, although lots of philosophers disagree with that, although I think they would be wrong, but I love Aristotle. Even if we can agree on the ends of a human being, can we determine what the virtues are? I think he gives us a good formula for that. I think this balancing act is a good way of determining what the virtues are. Even if we agree on the items above, can we instill virtues? Well, Benjamin Franklin shows that we can. Franklin noticed at a young age that he was a leader of boys. This is 13 Virtues. You can find it at 13virtues.com for those of you who are out there and can't see it. And you really can't see these in here either, so I'll go through a few of them. Franklin led boys as a young person, but he got him into a lot of trouble, and he noticed people didn't really like that. So he set about reforming himself. At one point in time, there's some stones that have been put together and delivered to make a house, and the boys decide, well, that would just make a better fishing pier. And Franklin leads them off, and they build this, they make a little pier out in the water where they can stand and fish. And his father, he gets caught, and his father admonishes him that nothing that is worthy is not worked for and earned. So he comes up with 13 virtues. Why 13? Because you can get through 4 complete cycles in a year. He puts them down on a piece of ivory. And if you had what he called spots, even if there was more work to do. Historically speaking, by the way, there were always 13 episodes in a series in television. Why was that? You could have a fall lineup, a spring lineup, and get through two sections of reruns. Because if you multiply 13 by 4, it comes out to 52, if I did the math correctly, which I think it did. And how many weeks are there in a year? 52, right? So he did, he lived by these. Temperance, eat not to dullness, drink not to elevation. Silence, speak not but what may benefit you and others. Avoid trifling conversations. Order, let all things have their place. Let each part of your business have its time. Resolution, resolve to perform what you ought, perform without failure what you resolve. Frugality, make no expense, but do good to others and yourself, waste nothing. Industry, lose no time, be always employed in something useful, cut off on all necessary actions. Sincerity, use no hurtful deceit, think innocently and justly. Speak accordingly. Justice, wrong no others by doing injury or admitting the benefits that you owe or your duty. Moderation, avoid the extremes. Cleanliness, tolerate no uncleanliness in body, clothes, or habitation. Tranquility, be not disturbed by trifles or accidents, common or unavoidable. Chastity, rarely use venery, this is an old word for sex, by the way, for health or offspring, never to dullness, weakness, or the injury of yours or another's peace or reputation. And humility, imitate Jesus and Socrates. I think these are good virtues to live by. And why do I point this out? Well, because although I agree with Kant, we shouldn't lie, sometimes we do know that, there is virtue in humility and not being brutally honest. But you have to understand this, and it's through habituation that we achieve these things. And I think Franklin proves that we can teach them. He went from very modest beginnings to being a statesman. His father was a craftsman, very lower middle class. He achieves fame. He's a scientist. He invents all kinds of things that are still in use today. Bifocals, the Franklin stove. He didn't take out patents on them. The lightning rod were based on his experiments. He wanted them to be in the public domain. So I think we can. I think it's worth thinking about. Now, on to the exam. And what will it look like? You will have to cite. The exam will be open on Thursday, so you do not have to come on class on Thursday. I've reserved that time for you to work on it. You have a week to complete it. It will consist of multiple questions, one of which will be an essay question that will be something like this. You have recently been hired as a marketing, communications, and public relations spokesman for Frontier Entertainment Theme Parks Company. I often use, you can find, if you look around in my essays, I usually use local businesses as examples, or thinly disguised local businesses as examples. The company is the owner-operator of 20 theme parks and venues throughout the United States. It's fictionalized, but you can figure out who it is. These are traditional theme park rides, arcade-style games, live entertainment, Wild West gunfight reenactments. The week after you're hired, a 65-year-old guest at one of the park, Buffalo Bill's Wild West Adventure in Oklahoma City, suffered a fatal heart attack after riding a major roller coaster called the Rattlesnake. The ride is described as the high-thrilling roller coaster through the Wild West, involves high-speed, loud sounds, thrilling special effects, and there's a small sign posted at the entrance of the ride that says in black and white print, patrons who are pregnant, suffer from cardiovascular issues, have other serious medical conditions, should not ride this ride. Participation in this ride constitutes assumption of the risk, and the company bears no responsibility for individuals' health risks that may occur. The guest that died was named Jim Mazza. He was visiting the park with his wife, children, and grandchildren who were visiting from out of state. They decided to take the grandchildren to the park as a treat for having traveled by car over 600 miles. Jim is a retired FBI agent, by the way. That's my stepfather, in case you. And he is a retired FBI agent. He was a special agent in charge of the field office in New Mexico. He's in reasonably good health for his age and never experienced any other heart issues prior to the attack. On the day of the incident, Jim and his children and grandchildren boarded the ride, and at the conclusion of the ride, he was suffering severe chest pains. One of the ride attendants helped him out of the coaster. He was obviously in distress. The attendant called the park medical office, which is located at the front gate at the opposite end of the park. It took 5 minutes for the park emergency medical technicians to reach Jim by golf cart with their defibrillator medical device. As they approached, Jim was in full arrest. The EMTs used the device to no avail. There was not a device located at the ride itself. Jim was transported to the local hospital where he was pronounced dead on arrival. The press were alerted to the incident by a bystander at the park. You were dispatched to meet with them and provide the following statement. We at Frontier Entertainment are deeply concerned about the well-being of all of our guests. Our hearts and prayers are with the Mazza family during this tragic time. We are here to help support the Mazza family at this time. We are assessing the situation and will not be able to provide or not be able to answer any questions. However, we will hold another press conference shortly when we have more information to share. Thank you. Following the press event, you met with the company's officers, the boardroom, including the company's attorney, Brad Borelli. Brad's position is that Mr. Mazza assumed the risk and that the company is not negligent or liable and is therefore should not engage in any talk of settlement. The company's vice president for finance, Robert Land, expressed concern that a lengthy lawsuit would affect the company's financials and ultimately its stock price. The president of the company has turned to you and asked for your advice based on what has been said from a marketing relations and public relations standpoint. He specifically asked you, will this affect the park ticket sales if the company doesn't settle? Will it harm the company's image, or will the company appear weak and vulnerable if they settle? How will a settlement affect the perception? Will one that is too small seem stingy, or one that is too large invite more lawsuits for the company? Base your answer on the totality of the circumstances and analysis of the facts and a valid ethical theory. So here's the ways you can fail. I've given this essay before, and I had somebody who their answer to the essay was no. That's not going to work, right? I had one student who said, how dare you expect us to answer 25 multiple choice questions and then an essay that's oppressive? Well, that's your opinion. How would I approach this? Well, a C-level answer would be a 5-paragraph essay that would go something like this. I have been asked to analyze a situation in which a patron at a theme park has died after experiencing a high-thrill ride. Based on a totality of the circumstances, I will use utilitarian ethics to answer this question. First, next paragraph, your first substantive point. If the theme park doesn't settle, the perception will probably be among people that we are insensitive and they may not want to come to our theme park. This will ultimately lead to a decrease in ticket sales, which may lead to bankruptcy. Some of you might remember a few years ago, a child from Minnesota was at the Disney theme parks. There were signs out that said, there may be alligators in the water. Kid went down to the lake and got drug off by an alligator. Was Disney technically, legally liable? No. Did they settle for millions of dollars? Yes. Why? Because it's the happiest place on earth. And it's going to destroy your brand image if we don't settle. You can use that as an example for you, so you might want to cite that. Right? This will not be the essay, by the way. Therefore, I recommend a robust settlement that will neither lead to frivolous lawsuits nor appear stingy. Second, if we don't engage in this, it'll ultimately affect our employees who will have to lay off if ticket sales decline. And that will affect vendors and ultimately society as a whole. Finally, this is overall beneficial because people and shareholders and citizens have recognized that they prefer to do business with ethical companies, and this shows that we are willing to engage in an ethical analysis. 5th paragraph. In conclusion, based on a totality of the circumstances, engaging in a stakeholder analysis and utilitarian principles, I would recommend that we offer a settlement in the amount of $1.5 million to compensate the family for their loss, pain, and suffering. Something like that would be a C-level answer. What would be a B-level answer? I will analyze the situation using both duty ethics and virtue ethics. From a utilitarian standpoint, offering a good settlement is likely, this is the second paragraph, to increase our market share as people will perceive that we're a good company. That will ultimately lead to more ticket sales, a positive brand image, an increase in stock price for the shareholders, safety and security for employees and vendors, and ultimately society as a whole. Duty ethics says, although we don't have a legal duty, moral duty is more than that. This is the next paragraph. Moral duty involves what we owe to other people. We are duty bound to protect people. In this case, we failed our duty. Although we had a defibrillator, it was 5 minutes away. It was not at the site of the ride. It took EMTs an extraordinary amount of time to get there. And as a result, a tragedy occurred, and we owe a duty to that family to make them whole, or as whole as we can. Further, duty ethics says that we have a duty to engage in honest and open communication with the public about what happened, and this will help ensure that we engage and take our responsibility and bear our fair share of the risk for what occurs. In conclusion, fifth paragraph, based on both duty ethics and utilitarian analysis, I believe we should offer a settlement in the amount of 1.5 million or whatever you want to do. What would an A level look like? I'm going to analyze the situation based on duty, utilitarian, and virtue ethics grounds. Recognizing that we, have to engage in an environmental scan, it would probably be more than 5 paragraphs. So that's sort of where I would go with this if it were me. Simply answering no is not going to get you anywhere. 1 paragraph, settled. It's the right thing to, not going to get you many points, right? I use a rubric to grade. Did you have an introductory paragraph with a thesis statement? What is a thesis statement? I am going to use utilitarian ethics to arrive at a conclusion that we should do blah, right? The facts support this, and then lay out paragraphs that support that. And in conclusion, there's a way academics write. My mother oftentimes says to me after I've published lots of papers, I've written 2 textbooks that have been published by Pearson. And, my mother says, Grant, your writing is uninspired. She was an academic. She taught English as well. Right? Yeah, this should not be a creative writing exercise. At the opposite end of the spectrum, I had a student, I had the one that said no, and then I had one that said, how dare you? Well, I get to decide what the test is going to be, right? I mean, if you want to decide what the test is going to be, get a PhD. And then you can decide what the test is going to be. The other end of the spectrum, I had a student that wrote, I approached this problem eager as a squirrel in an oak forest. When wham, bam, and I can tell you this because I'm not identifying any student. When wham, bam, the answer came to me like an elephant in a circus tumbling routine. And I wrote back, I leapt like a gazelle to the conclusion that you deserve an F for forcing me to read this drivel. Right? So, thesis statement, substantive analysis, well-reasoned conclusion that flows. Right? This is the way academics write. You write from, you argue. This is the way academics write. You argue, you start out with premise 1, and you argue to premise 2, and you argue to premise 3, and on to a conclusion. And there should be a connection between these that we call a nexus, a logical connection, right? So no wham, bam, elephants, tumbling routine. No one-word answers, things like that. There are about 5 minutes left, so do you have any questions? It will be on D2L. Obviously, because you will be required to cite sources, you do not have to use ProctorU or a lockdown browser. You will have as much time as you want to complete the exam, right? But you only have one chance, so you need to, sort of think about it, organize it, and not submit it until, because you only have one attempt at it. For the first exam on Thursday, will the test questions be based off the PowerPoint or the textbook? It will be based on both the PowerPoints, my lectures, and the textbook. About 50% comes from, you can cite the textbook as a source. There's a chapter on ethics in there, for example. And you can cite me and other sources. So that's a good question. I appreciate the question. Other questions that you might have? What percentage of the test will be essay? Will it be 50% essay and 50% multiple choice? Probably. It will probably be a balanced approach. Just like Fox News, fair and balanced. Okay? That's what I am, just fair and balanced. Other questions?
You said it was both lectures and PowerPoints?
It'll be based off the lectures, which you have access to. You have access to all the old lectures as well. I've loaded those on D2L in case I missed something or in case something happens to one of these, I get deleted or something like that. You can look at the lectures on my YouTube channel, and then also 50% from the textbook.
And did you want to work cited for the essay? Or just
If you are only citing the textbook, you can just put in parentheses the authors. I can't remember which authors I used in this class off the top of my head, but so and so et al. And the year of, and if it's my lectures, you can just cite the Gary 2020. You don't have to cite the YouTube. If you go beyond that, A-level papers generally go beyond those two sources. You're going to need to give me a complete work somehow. Just at the end, it doesn't have to be. You can use whatever parenthetical citation style you want. I don't care, MLA or APA. Other questions? No other questions? Let me see if there was another. What percentage? Okay, let me see if there's another. To reiterate, we have an unlimited time to take the exam. Nope, you have an unlimited amount of time. I'm giving you Thursday to work on it, but you have an unlimited amount of time to take it. Is there a rubric or anything to make sure our short answer questions are answered the right way? It's going to be an essay. So there is a rubric. Basically, the rubric is, did you have an introduction with a thesis? And I rate it on a sort of a scale of not there, fair to exceptional. Did you provide substantive analysis, and did you reach a well-reasoned conclusion? So I do use a rubric. I don't think I post it. I do have it. I can see if I can figure out how to post it on D2L, get it out of the thing, but it's basically 3 components. Introduction. Actually, there's 4 components. I take that back. There's a spelling and grammar component that I look at briefly, but I'm not going to be. Although my mother was an English teacher, and although I oftentimes find students, using dangling modifiers and things like that, I generally don't. I'm not going to grade for that level. It's just a few glaring inconsistencies. For example, students have misspelled my name generally, and names are important. Try to get it right. Spelled Aguirre, things like that. All right. Other questions? I answered those.
And we have till next Thursday.
You'll have a week. Yes, 1 week to complete the exam. All right. Any other questions? Going once. Going twice. Well, enjoy Thursday. I will see you a week from today.
I mean, usually know these are a lot, and I don't really think I can save it from that. But,